Hello, everybody.
Oh, hello.
Today's video is going to be a continuation of the deck building series that I was doing a few weeks ago. If you haven't already checked that out, there's a playlist of it on my channel. I have like Deck Building 101 and How to Build a Meta Deck featuring J.W. Krewall, Flex Daddy Righteous. But today's video is going to be, I think, a little contentious. I don't think people want people playing these types of decks, but we're going to be doing how to play a control deck today. And that is going to be an interview featuring Ethan. Ethan Heggie, I think. I'm so bad with your last name. I'm sorry. But Ethan from HegsterTCG. That's what you need to remember. HegsterTCG. He runs the events on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday nights over on his Twitch channel. So definitely check that out. I'll link that in the description. But Ethan is also somewhat adept at playing control. He was somebody that I played against when I was doing some Darkness Ablaze testing. He was the one that built the Toxtricity Mill deck. Anyways, I decided to talk to him about control. This is sort of a conversation about how to build a control deck, what control decks try to do. So if you're looking to get into control style archetypes or decks, even if they're not in the best position in the meta right now, who knows that might change in the future. But before we get into the video, I want to give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, buyptcgocodes.com. They have been kind enough to sponsor the channel. So if you need codes, code cards, etc. For Darkness Ablaze or any of the other sets that have code cards available, basically, you can head over to their website and use code Gyroshan for 5% off. Link in the description as well to them. And thanks to them for sponsoring this channel. All right, let's just jump into the video. Do you want to just go ahead and introduce yourself?
My name is Ethan Heggie, professional Pokemon player from Northeast area, running tournaments recently. I stream on Twitch, and yeah, that's pretty much. I
love the downplay. Like, he runs the HegsterTCG event, so that's who we're talking to. If you haven't already heard of those events, I don't know what you've been doing in the world of Pokemon, but during the pandemic, depending on when you're watching this, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings on his Discord and Twitch channel. So so today we're going to be talking about control decks. And do you want to just like give us a sense of like, when people say control, what does control really mean to you? And like, are there different flavors of control decks?
So yeah, when we look at the term of control within a deck, we're usually looking at that third win condition that is usually not achieved in Pokemon. So that win condition of your opponent has no more cards to draw at the start of their turn. And that's usually via the means of taking the pace of the game and sort of putting it into your hand, into your court, rather than a normal game sort of being back and forth between two players. Control sort of wants to slow things down and make the opponent have as little outs to win and take away those win conditions of knocking out Pokemon, taking knockouts, powering up their board, etc. In many different ways. It's sort of hard to sort of generalize it all together, but that's sort of the quick way to explain control, sort of to on the basic level, basic definition.
Yeah, I think people would say, like, it's basically not letting your opponent play the game. A successful control strategy
That's a good way to say,
is your opponent ends up being like, well, okay then. Okay, so in terms of understanding like when control might be viable in a given meta, and even just thinking outside of the recent like Orangaroo with resource management, right?
Mm-hmm.
What in your mind do you think are the parameters that make control a viable strategy?
So when usually looking at control, obviously depends on the type of control, right? What cards are in format, all that stuff. It's important to see what is popular and what is included in a lot of decks. So a good example for this was pre-Sword and Shield, when a lot of decks sort of revolved around the strategy of we do X amount of strategy to get our Pokemon powered up with energy. We use cards like the Deny to draw ourselves cards, sure, but our main strategy here is we use like support Pokemon that have one-time effects on their boards. And the draw is pretty much one-time usage, either via supporters or via Pokemon or support Pokemon, so it's not something on their board. So their board state is pretty much just for attacking and not as much support draw, like we saw introduced more recently in Sword and Shield. So when that is what a format is based off of, when that takes up most of a format, these decks that want to try to control the board to the point where the opponent can just have a powered up attacker, and that is good enough for control to just get the energy off the board. Meanwhile, control's relevance might go down. For example, if a card like Oranguru from Sword and Shield comes out, where it can manipulate the top deck, which is what control tries to do. And again, that's one more variable that control wants to have in check, right? It wants to be able to control all of the opponent's variables. And when cards like that come into play, or for example, when cards like Cincino come into play that can draw cards, or even more recently in Darkness Ablaze, when a card like Poltergeist comes in play that allows you to discard draw cards, right?
Yeah, I think that's a good example of, like, you know, if a meta has support Pokemon like Cinccino or whatever it might be that allows your opponent to draw more, then yeah, it's hard to make that lock stick. I think another interesting aspect of it is if your opponent has various ways of powering energy up. I think is that like an interesting like difference to like how many decks have that kind of explosiveness?
Yes, a lot of times pressure is another big thing, right? So if decks are able to win and on average on 4 turns, obviously control isn't like that. Meanwhile, if some decks take a little bit longer to win, right, they're also used to not needing to knock out a small Pokemon, especially when things get bigger and bigger, right, and numbers that you need to hit get higher and higher. It sort of becomes, hey, control has these lower HP stuff. Is this the time to come in, right? We don't really need to be hit by these big numbers here. And that's sort of, again, your opponent is playing a much longer game. Usually they're playing a shorter game, but against control, when you don't need to hit those numbers. And instead of being used to playing a deck that's supposed to take prizes on larger things, when it's just taking one prize, it doesn't matter if it's supposed to hit 270 damage or 120 damage, it's still taking one prize. So
yeah, I think the lack of prize manipulation is maybe important for control, which is what makes it in a post ADP world a bit difficult.
Yeah.
Okay, so say that you think that control is viable in a given meta, in theory. What kind of cards are important to make control work?
So there's a lot of different variants of control, but a general rule of cards that will usually be included in some sort of control deck are recovery cards that bring back specific cards. A good example in a lot of decks is Palpad. Palpad is a way to get back your supporters. A lot of control revolves around those supporter cards, right? Like Mars, Jesse James, Surge, Belaba. A lot of cards that, again, alter your opponent's side of the board. They don't really help your side of the board, but they're more to sort of hinder your opponent. So the ability to constantly have access to those and get them back is another big thing. Just in general, getting cards back from this card pile. Deck cannot win usually if it doesn't have access to cards multiple times. So the ability to get that back, a great example is Oranguru from Ultra Prism. Again, recycling cards allows for a loop to continue, which allows control to continue. Other cards, such as disruption cards, so you want to have the ability to manipulate energy, right? Because you could have your opponent have no cards in hand and have ways to control the top of their deck, but if they have something that's going to swing for 200 damage every turn, doesn't matter what you do there, you're still going to lose the game, because it doesn't matter if they just go draw attack, they're still taking prizes and you're not developing any further lock on them or hurting their board state anymore. Energy disruption cards, and then the last one is some sort of hand / top deck cards as well. You want to, again, put your opponent in a situation where they're not able to play the game. As silly as that sounds, you basically want to give them the worst outs they have in the deck. Take their deck, even if it's consistent, and sort of turn it upside down on them. So cards usually like Quick Ball, if their opponent's bench is full, the card is useless. Usually it's good in the early game, but Quick Ball is useless. Or maybe in most matchups, I need multiple Pokemon to set multiple Pokemon up, but in most matchups against control, you just need to set up a single Pokemon, maybe 2 copies of Pokemon to be safe. So those become dead cards as well. So
I think that brings me very neatly into the next little section, which is, somebody's building a deck from scratch. You probably have already covered this to a variety of degrees, but like, what are the important combos that you want to build around? So say like it's one turn. What does an amazing control turn look like to you?
You usually want to achieve 3 things on your turn. The first turn is you want to take all the threats off the board. So usually that's just attacking, right? So if they have an attacker powered up, if they have multiple attackers powered up, if they have access to deal damage to you next turn, right? You want to try to take the threat of them dealing damage and taking prize off the board. Obviously, you're not taking prizes, so there's no point in you powering up your prizes if your goal is to, again, just kind of sacrifice taking knockouts, sacrifice taking prizes, and technically put that towards making sure your opponent doesn't take prizes. So that's number 1. Number 2 is manipulating the hand, right? Again, if there's a hand size, there are cards that can be played, and sometimes you don't know the knowledge in the hand. So manipulating the hand is important, and the last thing is manipulating your opponent's top deck. So manipulating what they're going to draw into every turn, right?
You look at some control decks. I think Sander is a really good example, right? The second place deck from the POG Championships.
Mhm.
His deck had 20 some odd one-ofs in it. You look at a deck like that and you think how is this consistent? Or it's pretty crazy. So thinking about those decks, how important are techs in a control deck? I mean, granted, I know the meta it's all meta dependent to some degree.
Sure, yeah.
But some decks have a general strategy of I want to be as consistent as possible. Does control need to be more teched out or less, generally speaking?
I think, again, techs are dependent on what you expect to hit and what your meta is. So, for example, if you expect to hit ADP, maybe you'll consider throwing in what Sander threw in and played the Mr. Mime for the evens, again, to prevent alter creation. So, techs are important in beating what you expect. Sometimes there's times where I don't tech because I know what I expect I can beat without teching. For when I played Pidgey, if I know that I don't need to play something like Giraffe, if I know there's not a lot of Mewtwo and Mew in the field, then I just won't throw in Giraffe because it's not needed. Sometimes over-teching, sometimes teching is good. A lot of times teching is good, but sometimes over-teching can be bad because, again, you brought it up, consistency is definitely a key for control. It is one of the more, I would say, inconsistent decks in the format, especially because it needs to set up. When it sets up, it rolls fine, it does what it wants to do, but especially with how much disruption is continuously coming out with Marnie and even opposing reset stamps and fun stuff like that. It's definitely important to have consistency in your deck, and also accepting what you're going to lose to, because control doesn't beat everything all the time. There's things that it loses to. The reason I didn't play it for Pog was because it lost to ADP, and ADP was its ADP matchup is weird. We didn't know about Mr. Mime. If I knew about Mr. Mime, I would have played it. But
okay, so say you're a person who's decided for whatever reason you're going to play a control deck. What is the difference in terms of pacing and patience maybe that a control deck requires versus a typical deck?
It's very different. I mean, I obviously it's not about this topic's not about sequencing, but just a quick topic on sequencing. Sequencing is very important when it comes to control. You'll find yourself usually when playing stuff like, I'll bring up Mewtwo Welder, which is a deck that also requires a lot of sequencing in it. But you'll see sometimes if you don't if you Stellar Wish before you Quick Ball or stuff like that, it usually won't matter as much. But with control, sequencing is very important because there are specific cards, again, especially when you're playing a lot of low copies of cards like that, like 2 Reset Stamp, 2 Chip Chip, that you need to find. Sequencing and searching and doing all that stuff, knowing when to play cards and when to hold and managing is another big part of the game that you usually won't see a lot of other places. I probably have 150 plus hours of control under my belt, and I still struggle to pilot the deck correctly sometimes. It's a deck that I'm still constantly learning and still constantly working on. Playing slow is generally what you'll find yourself doing a lot of the time. Even though the lock is autopilot, there are some matchups where it's not as simple as resource back in, chip, scoop up nets, other stuff like that, and every turn just lock them, because again, you have to look at variables. What if they do draw the lock, right? What if they do have something on their board that I can't take care of? So a lot of it is also sort of adapting, and you'll have a lot of lines of play in the early game, sort of setting yourself up for success. You obviously have the main end goal of either chip lock combo or energy denial combo, or obviously deck out is the obvious win con for the deck. So playing smart is another big thing there, and always keeping track. It requires you to know what you prize, because again, you don't have the luxury of just drawing. Let's say I prize my key supporter I need, or my one support Pokemon. I don't have the luxury to go, I'll just knock something out here and take it off the prizes. So again, when it comes to piloting, you have to know what you prized and know how to play around that, so that when it comes to later and you're like, here we go, I can quick ball for my Articuno, and you're like, well, both my Articunos are prized. How do I get the energy out the board? And maybe you need to bring back that boss's orders in your discard pile so that you could go for a gust lock instead of an energy lock on an attacker. So a lot of it is improvising. Your turns are very based off what your opponent does. Usually there's a lot of decks that are like, I'm going to alter creation and I'm going to swing no matter what you put up, or I'm going to boss whatever you put up. I don't care what else you do on your turn. This deck is I find myself paying attention more to what my opponent is doing playing control than I feel like I would with other decks.
I think another thing when I'm playing against it as well is realizing that they don't necessarily care usually about giving up prizes early, right? It's like they're just here to set up. You can take 2, 3, 4 prizes even, because once I get you in the lock, there's no way you're getting out of it. Like, that's the ultimate end goal. So I think that's very different from like maybe a typical deck, again, where you're like, oh, should I let this die? Like, what's the bit? No, you're just like, no, it's gonna take me a minute. You just play your game. And
feeding is definitely another important part. Feeding means like giving your opponent prizes, knowing what to give and when to use cards like that are recovery cards. Obviously, there'll be a little bit less here in this post-rotation format, but in other formats as well. There's times where I know I want to feed my opponent Zacian because, again, I would rather lock them at 1 prize than 2 prizes, right? Or I know I would rather use that bench spot for that third Minccino or Cincino I need to get down, right? Or I purposely will go ahead and not resource for a turn to commit something like a Recycle Energy to retreat into maybe a support Pokemon like Mew that I would rather die than to manage back in 3 cards I don't want. So a lot of it is, it's very hard to explain, but you have to sort of see a lot of turns ahead. I think of it like chess, right? You're not playing chess turn by turn. If you're looking to mate in 5, right, you're not going to just all of a sudden not know about mate in 5 and then on your 5th turn be like, oh, look, this is opening up, right? I have checkmate. So
I think the last question that I have is really about dealing with opponents, because when you play Control online or maybe in person, I think in person I would hope people are more cordial, but who knows? I would say that people can get upset when they're playing against Control. What are the typical responses that you might expect from an opponent playing Control, and how might you deal with that?
Well, people are usually playing Pokemon for 2 reasons: to have fun or to win, sometimes both. And when your opponent cannot have fun and cannot win, and you take both of those off the table, it can definitely be hard for your opponent to sort of sit there with a happy face, right, and smile. I know I've been on both ends of the stick before. So I've definitely had my fair share of interesting reactions in person. I've also had my fair share of interesting reactions online as well. I've had people who were chill enough to just kind of sit there and draw past. I've had people who would make remarks and make comments to me in person and also online as well when I'm playing Control. So if you're someone who can't take that or whatever, maybe don't pilot Control. If you're not someone who, I guess, is playing one of the villain decks in Pokemon, I guess you consider it. It's one of the non battles, so to say. Again, like not very similar to what an actual battle would be like. Maybe I can't really stress this enough of like, really doesn't matter what your opponent's going to do. You have to stay focused and sort of play your own game. Your opponent's obviously will do what they can do to win. And sometimes getting in your head is a way that I've seen people slip up on lock, right? If you slip out up on lock, that's the one chance your opponent needs to draw out. And usually when they draw out, they're at 1 to 2 prizes as well. So it opens up that door again, especially if you play on something like an Articuno, right? So I have to make sure that I stay on my game and know what's happening, and don't let that shit phase me, dude. Don't let it get to me.
All right, well, Ethan, thank you for joining me. I know I kind of already plugged your tournament, but do you want to plug some things here at the end?
Sure. Go follow me on Twitter and on Twitch. I stream the tournaments every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I run them as well. If you guys want to be part of that, there's Discord links flying around somewhere. You can find it on my Twitter. You can find it everywhere.
I'll put it in the description.
Perfect. So we play those on Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 6:30 p.m. Eastern. 2-pack entry. We had top players from around the world all these days. So if you want good competition, want to have some fun, go play. It's pretty cheap to enter. It's like 2 packs. So and yeah, shout out to everyone on the server, everyone who's supported, and yeah, thanks for having me on, Sean. Appreciate it.
All right, so that was Ethan. Thank you, Ethan, for giving us all of your insight on Control decks, for coming on and talking about it. Hopefully this was helpful to you. If you have any questions about Control, feel free to leave it in the comments, or you can reach out to myself or Ethan at HegsterTCG on Twitter, who can answer any questions or comments that you have about playing Control. Yeah, like I said, hopefully you enjoyed this. I got a couple more videos in this series coming out featuring some conversations with folks. But yeah, thank you all so much for watching, and I will catch you in a future video. Carpe awesome.